Hello everyone and welcome to Lies, the part of Extra Credits where we talk about all the things we got wrong.
Extra history?
The extra history, what have you, the things we do.
Starting with that one.
Right, there we go, corrections, great. And as you can see, because last time it seemed to go really well, we figured it was fun to sort of do this as a question and answer format. So I will be asking the questions since this is Soraya's series, and Soraya will be giving us the answers. Let's start with the hardest question first. What do we screw up?
Oh, it's always good to get this one out of the way. Well, from the beginning of the series to the end, we had the wrong version of British Parliament, which we used whenever we referred to them. We drew British Parliament with Big Ben. Did you know that the Palace of Westminster actually burned down in 1834, so after the events of our story? And after that burned down, they said, let's build a new one and let's build a giant clock tower with it. And so anytime you see Big Ben prior to 1844, you're pretty wrong. Like
in our series.
Yeah, but we got the British flag right.
I don't believe you.
I don't believe me either. I'm pretty sure we did, though. A lot of people pointed out that Maine was not an original colony, which is true, but Maine was actually a part of the colony of Massachusetts, so its inclusion on the maps was intentional. It was a part of the colonies, it just wasn't its own thing yet, and Vermont was the same way. New York actually claimed control of Vermont, which Vermont disputed since Vermont had declared sovereignty in, I think, 1777, or... Yeah, it had declared sovereignty right around the beginning of the Revolution, and so that was a thing, and we'll actually come back to that particular thing later in the story. And then a number of people were pointing out that several times in the series we reduced the American complaints to they just didn't want to pay taxes. And yes, it is definitely more complicated than that. There's the whole no taxation without representation, so it's a question of whether the taxes are fair in the first place. And also the fact that during what we call in the States the French and Indian War, and what the rest of the world refers to as the 7 Years' War, the colonies actually spent quite a lot of money financing the war on their side of things. And Britain had promised to help pay them back for that expense, but instead raised taxes. So they weren't very happy about that. But if you want really the full details of that story, it kind of has to be its own series. So,
well, the 7 Years' War needs to be its own series at some point
Definitely.
Anyway, because it's kind of the first real world war. Like, if you want to talk the history of global conflict, I think it's 7 Years' War is something that we really ought to do at some point.
Absolutely. You could do like a rotating 7 Years' War from this perspective and this perspective and this perspective, because there were so many fronts on which that was fought. But yeah, so if you do want that, vote for it on Patreon. And the same thing goes for the Constitutional Convention. There were a lot of details about the Constitutional Convention, which I sort of took a shortcut through because we are not talking about the Constitution here. We're talking about the Articles of Confederation. And I think the Constitutional Convention would be its own series if we wanted to make it one. But some details we did get wrong. I straight up said that all 13 colonies attended the Constitutional Convention, but Rhode Island boycotted it.
Rhode Island, it makes sense.
Yes. Having lived in Rhode Island for 6 years, I am so proud of that little state and its spunkiness. But yes, they boycotted it, so they were not there. And we also portrayed Hamilton as Madison as continually working together throughout the Constitutional Convention to, run it through. And all of you who seem to know Hamilton lyrics by heart know very well that is not true. Hamilton actually left the convention early. He was stymied by some of the New York representatives who saw things very differently than him. And he felt that on the whole, the constitutional reforms were not doing enough to make the federal government stronger. So he was not an active part of the convention for all of it, but he was active writing the Federalist Papers with Madison, in which they debated a lot of the finer points of government and how it should be organized. So that was a shortcut.
Okay, so moving on from the errors, let's talk about some of the really big things that come up every time we just talk about the American Revolution period.
Yeah.
First off, let's talk about Canada, because there's always that discussion of why Canada didn't also join the revolutionary effort and why Canada was even distinct from the United States as we think of it.
Sure. So Canada was a recent acquisition of the British Empire. It had basically been ceded to them by the French after the, again, French and Indian War or 7 Years' War. And Quebec, in particular, the most populous place in Canada at the time, was mostly French people who didn't really have a lot of contact with these American colonists who had been British from the start, right? So there really wasn't a lot of camaraderie there. And then you also have places like, there were a couple of other settled areas of Canada at this point. Just to give one example, Nova Scotia had recently been settled by Scottish colonists, and they were off doing their own thing, including their own rebellions, which were not as successful. But they didn't really have an interest in linking up with these Americans either. And the rest of the land was pretty sparsely occupied by fur traders mostly, who were working for the Hudson Bay Company, because the Hudson Bay Company was pretty much seeing Canada as just a thing to monetize, not a thing to become a new colony and settle. And then on top of that, the American loyalists who were loyal to Britain and wanted to stay part of Britain started to flee to Canada, and they actually started forming what would become Ontario. As part of their way of escaping the revolution and the aftermath of the revolution.
Well, and at some point, if we ever do the revolution itself, I'm sure we'll cover the ways in which our revolution did bleed over to Canada.
Yeah. It was impacted, but they did not join, even though the Articles of Confederation actually specifically invite Canada to join if they ever want to. There's Article 11 says that if Canada decides that it wants to become a state, it can just do that, and it doesn't have to go through any kind of approval process. And Canada was basically like, no thank you.
I'm sad that didn't survive to the actual Constitution. So now we got to talk about the other big one, right? Mm-hmm. Which is obviously slavery. As sort of the impact of slavery on our Constitution and the history of our country is enormous. And we sort of know the 3/5 rule and what happened in the final working out of this. What was its impact on the Articles of Confederation?
So the Articles of Confederation very deliberately avoided the slavery topic. It came up really early during one of the revision passes, because the initial way that it was determined that states would pay money, right, what portion they would pay, was going to be based on how much population they had. And that immediately triggered an argument about whether slaves count as people. And when we fast forward to the Constitutional Convention, we see that they come up with an absolutely horrible compromise, what you referenced, the 3/5 compromise. And for those who don't know, the 3/5 compromise basically said that every slave counts for 3/5 of a person. And rather than a full one, so that in the apportionment of taxes it would be lower. And that same argument started during the Articles of Confederation revision process, and it got so contentious that they just threw up their hands and said, never mind, we're not going to base anything off population, we're going to base it on the value of the land of the states. So they kind of avoided the question. Later on, when the Articles was in operation, you had them passing the land ordinances that determined what happens in the Ohio River Valley, and the Northwest Ordinance took the opposite course from that, where they did specifically take it on, and they, mostly because of Thomas Jefferson, wrote in a thing that specifically prohibited slavery in the Ohio River Valley, which had its own repercussions, unfortunately, because once that became like a clear law for this northern segment of the country, the southern states kind of got worried about this and thought, we're going to be outnumbered if we allow this to happen. And so in a way it created a ripple effect where when later other portions of the American West were settled, the southern representatives insisted that you had to make specific allowances for slavery to extend slavery.
Well, and I mean, it's one of the big points that leads up to the actual Civil War is the fact that with that original sort of Ohio River Valley doctrine that spread west, you had the slave states becoming a smaller and smaller portion of the United States. Yeah. And they became worried that if they waited any longer, right, that they would just be, as you said, too outnumbered to do anything. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting always to me to see how much of that is sort of enshrined or the cause of these early documents. In this particular case, though, you talked about the land value. Do you know why that wasn't carried over to the Constitution itself?
I don't.
I would guess it was just more impractical to assess land value than to get population census.
Because
land value is very arguable. Like in the Roman Empire, right, they did everything by land value, but then they had to go have people go to each farm, and then the farmer would argue, oh no, my land's worthless, terrible soil. I totally shouldn't be taxed, right? Everybody hide the grapevines. And so I wonder if it was just the impracticality of dealing with land value.
You know what? I would love to see someone in the comments weigh in, because I bet somebody knows.
I'm sure somebody knows.
Yeah.
This is the beauty of the internet.
So do answer us in the comments, because I don't know. I didn't research much into the framing of the Constitution since, like I said, we stopped at that point.
Next, we have to talk about also sort of the role of Native Americans, because clearly as this revolution is going on and this thing that we think about as the foundation of America, there were a lot of people living here, and in that area and throughout this continent. Tell me about the role of Native Americans, not only in this conflict, but also regarding the foundation and sort of the ideas that formed the Articles and then the Constitution.
Sure. Well, for starters, we should talk again about the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We covered that in the Hiawatha series.
Yeah.
But Benjamin Franklin was the first traceable link between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the way that the United States government was later formed. He had a paper in Pennsylvania. That was how he first sort of rose to prominence, was running this newspaper. And he covered a meeting between some Haudenosaunee leaders and some American colonial leaders. And during this meeting, one of the leaders of the Haudenosaunee was saying, you guys should be a confederacy like us. You should be brothers, right? And he was fascinated by this. And so later he actually teamed up with a friend of his and wrote an entire book about how the Haudenosaunee Confederacy worked. And you can see a lot of those ideas get incorporated into his later ideas of government. So that's really interesting, and it's really positive. And unfortunately, we have to follow it by talking about the places that were not so positive, like the Ohio River Valley, which is that whole, whenever we're referring to the Western Territory in this series, we're mostly referring to the Ohio River Valley, because that was the place that was the most focus of, let's move people there. To start with, even way before the revolution happened, there were all kinds of land prospectors who were signing really questionable agreements with Native Americans, and a lot of times they would say, oh, we met with the chief of so-and-so, but really it was just some person, right, who maybe was of that tribe and maybe not, and maybe understood what was being said and maybe did not, but basically they got them to sign a thing and claim that this gave them legal rights to the land. And the American states were, the state governments were frustrated by this, because they would appeal to British Parliament and say, that's not fair, right? That's not legal. And British Parliament said, a deal is a deal, right? We have to uphold it. And so that was actually a large part of the reason that there was so much pushback from the states on giving Congress control of that land, because they were convinced that Congress would do the same thing Parliament did and basically just validate all of these treaties. And the states, of course, they're not being kind in this interaction. They're not like, oh, let's give that land back to the natives. They wanted it for themselves. It was very self-interested policy that they had, but it led to a lot of tension already. And then once the American settlers, especially the Virginian settlers, started moving into that area, you had all sorts of other problems coming out as a result of the war. For one, Britain was recruiting several Native American tribes and people to be active participants in the war, starting around 1778. They would lead active raids where the British and the Native Americans would sort of team up and go, and initially it was called causing mischief, but it was meant to scare the American settlers or to punish them, right? And it was acts of war. But the settlers kind of did go into panic mode about this, and they did not distinguish between combatants and allies when it came to Native Americans. They sort of lumped everyone under one umbrella and considered that if you're a Native American, you're my enemy, right? And so they would attack villages that were peaceful, villages that had treaties and alliances, even with the American, various states and American leaders, and they would attack them. And there were several really gruesome slaughters. And of course, one gruesome slaughter provokes another gruesome slaughter in retaliation, and it really got very nasty out there. So there was a lot of very bad stuff happening. And then you have the Land Ordinance of 1785, which is that place where Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, figured out what to do with the Western territories, right? And they set up these processes for something to become a state. And it's often touted as one of the great successes of the Articles of Confederation, but I avoided writing that because to me it was an instrument of conquest.
Sure.
Because the whole reason that they set up this slow process, this orderly process to form statehood, was to prevent these wars that were going on between settlers and natives. And again, not out of genuine philanthropy, but because they just wanted to avoid open war, and then they could take their time to basically push the Native Americans, push the Native Americans back peacefully, right? But without provoking an open conflict, that made it possible for them to be like, oh, we're using diplomatic channels, but really the end result is the same of, genocide by effect and moving people off of their land. And it was a cruel process all around because they also kicked poor white homesteaders off land that they had occupied. If these people had moved in before the ordinances came into place, and they were considered, not the right kind of settler, they actually had federal militias going through and sweeping people out of their land and saying, that home you built, you have to tear it down and burn it because we've decided that this other thing is going to be here and you're not welcome. So despite those being touted as one of the successes of the Articles, I actually think it was a tremendous cruelty that was implemented under that period.
Talking about these sort of cruelties and inhumanities that come up with the slaves, with the Native Americans. We talked a little bit about John Dickinson and this idea of human rights. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Because that was something I was very curious about. Yeah,
so I came to like Dickinson quite a bit. He was a Quaker, which is the colloquial term for a member of the Society of Friends, but unofficially. His family, his wife, his children, they were Quakers, but he could not officially embrace it because at least the chapter of Quakerism that was near him said pacifism, right? You have to be a pacifist. And Dickinson was very much in with like the ideals of equality and peaceful dissent, but he did believe that violence in the defense of something was justified, which is why we actually see him drop out of the Second Continental Congress and go fight in the war, right? Because he was defending his homeland. But when he was drafting the Articles of Confederation, his very first draft was really progressive in a lot of surprising ways. For one thing, it was the first instance of gender-neutral language in a Western constitution. He used the phrase person, not man. Mm-hmm. So he was opening, he did not explicitly create, equality for women and other people of other genders, but he opened the door, or he wanted to. He also included protection for vulnerable minorities, including Native Americans, and empowered the federal government to secure religious liberty, which is something that, is part of the Constitution today, but wasn't even added until the 14th Amendment, so way ahead of its time. But that was all part of his vision for a strong central government. And once he left and had to do and like I said, he joined the Revolutionary War because he did not feel right signing the Declaration of Independence there without a constitution being in place. Once he left, that all got picked apart. The human rights protections disappeared. The strong central government disappeared. And so, there was this effort on his part to do that, but it didn't really take, unfortunately.
I mean, and it's interesting to me that we see when we get the actual Constitution, almost the same thing going back and forth with the amendments, right?
Yeah.
Sort of in reverse, where people want to at least provide some of these protections enshrined in the Constitution, but how much of it was picked apart or reduced.
Mm-hmm. And he was a part of the Constitutional Convention, but only briefly because he got very ill and had to leave.
So tell me, there was another one that I wanted to hit on. I didn't actually know much about Robert Morris before this, and his story seems fascinating, and I didn't know that some dude bankrolled a lot of the revolution. So, any interesting stories? Anything else that you want to say about Robert Morris?
Oh gosh, yes. Yes, he could be his own one-off. He was really fascinating. He was a self-made man. His father basically sent him away to the United States. Well, they weren't the United States yet, but sent him away to the colonies. And then shortly after his father sent him away, he was serving in the British Navy, and I don't know why, but they were firing a gun in his father's honor, and the gun actually struck him, and he died from the same gun that was fired in his honor.
Man.
Right. That kind of sucks. But meanwhile, Robert Morris, a family friend, helped him get an apprenticeship at a local trading firm, and he befriended the son of the guy who ran it. And then the two of them decided to form their own business when they were still very young. They're in their 20s, but they were just wildly successful, and in large part because Morris was very shrewd. He was very good at, ledgers and balancing books and predicting where trade would go and all that kind of thing. He was rich on the scale of like Bill Gates, basically. And he had this. He also had this early involvement in slave trade that ended in financial disaster for him. And it eventually led to him opposing slavery, not on, moral grounds, but actually on economic grounds, because he said this is a bad deal. And it's a little funny, sad, because in the same way that if someone rich today were to say, oh, I think that stock is, worthless, that company is going down, basically he helped end slavery, or at least reduce the levels of slavery in the northern colonies, because he said this, and because the northern colonies were very mercantile and were very about like merchant trade. And when the best trader among them said slave trade not good, right, like not financially profitable, a lot of them abandoned it. And so it sort of created a wave where it's odd. He's an odd fellow. But so his last act as financier, he did pay off the troops one more time. He paid them during the move to Yorktown. He financed that. And then if you remember, those troops, a lot of them couldn't go home because of bankruptcies. And they did eventually disperse when the treaty was signed. And a lot of the reason they were able to do that was because Robert Morris once again paid them out of pocket. And it led to the soldiers calling something Morris bucks, which was not a real form of currency, but was their colloquial term for, Robert Morris paying you out of pocket. Not all of them could be paid. He was rich, but not quite that rich, and generous, but not quite that generous. But he did pay off a large amount of the debts that were paid to owed to the army.
I'm sorry we don't get to hear about him more in our sort of pop histories of the war.
Me too. Him and Dickinson, I think, get really short shrifted in this. But he had kind of an unfortunate end. He made some bad land investments. This is after the Revolution, after the Constitutional Convention. I guess all the Hamilton fans will appreciate knowing that George Washington originally tapped Morris to be the first Secretary of the Treasury. And Morris said, actually, no, you should get this young guy, Alexander Hamilton. I think he's good. So that happened. And then after that, he basically went back into private business, and he made some land investments that really did not turn out for him. And they turned out actually so bad that he wound up in debtor's prison. And the United States Congress passed a bankruptcy act in 1800 specifically to get Robert Morris out of prison, which they did. And he got out, but he was old and he was sick and he died soon after.
It's funny how many positive effects he had because of his economic life, right? Like having any bankruptcy protection was revolutionary right at that time.
Yeah.
But no, that's fascinating. He's a fascinating guy. Maybe someday we'll do a one-off on him.
Yeah, I really liked him. I would love to.
So I have my own thoughts on this, but one of the questions that obviously comes up whenever we're dealing with this, and especially in a series like this, which highlights it, with such chaos in the United States and such disorganization, how did this massive bureaucratic empire of the British lose, right? How did we win this war?
I think it is better to start thinking of it as not that the British lost the war to the U.S. colonials, but that they lost it to the remaining European powers. Because France and Spain both came in really hard on the side of the American colonies. Basically, everyone wanted to see Britain get their comeuppance. And a lot of other countries in Europe, like Holland, for example, played a really big role in bankrolling it. The French and Spanish actually also contributed troops. The Spanish played a pivotal role handing the British a naval defeat in the Caribbean, which meant that the British could not bring their entire navy to bear on the rebellious colonists, and the British Navy is their main source of strength. Not to mention just the difficulty of conducting an overseas war. The troops that they had available that they could even send to the colonies was a small percentage of their actual troop power. And they had the Caribbean to console them as well. So there was a certain movement in Britain among some people who were like, these are not the richest colonies we have anyway.
Well, so it's interesting to me that for the powers that came in, especially for the French, right, we see the repercussions of this not too far down the line.
Oh, yeah.
Where revolution sweeps across Europe, but really, comes out of the expense and the effort here to support the American Revolution.
Yeah, the French monarchy very much put themselves in debt to support this revolution, and that debt, like you said, it steamrolled into their own revolution.
Well, and a lot of American ideas about democracy and all that were also brought back to the continent, that fueled the intelligentsia being part of that revolution as well.
Yeah. That'd be a lesson to you about spite. They did it to spite the British, and look what happened.
I will say that I always feel like many modern prolonged guerrilla conflicts, part of the reason that the French and the Spanish got in it is because the British were unable to win right away, right? The British and everyone at that time was used to the type of warfare where you win one or two decisive battles, or you capture the enemy capital, and that's the war, and then you go to the treaty table and you get some of their land and it's done, right? The American ability, and especially to hold out, and George Washington's ability to always keep the army intact enough so there was an army in the field, I think shouldn't be undersold either.
That's true.
Because really, as you said, the expense of conducting a multi-continental war was very high, and just the longer that the U.S. could hold out, the more it was costing the British, the less the opinion would be at home, and the greater the likelihood of other nations saying, hey, maybe these folks have a shot, let's jump in, right?
Yeah.
This one cracked me up. When we got
Which one? There are so many.
Yes, that's true. I do love the parts of history that are comedy of errors, especially when the comedians win. But why didn't the U.S. even show up to sign its own treaty?
Oh gosh, it was just a mess. I mean, the big excuse that's given is that there was a blizzard, and I will grant it was an enormous blizzard. We're talking several feet of snow, and the letters that were sent to some of these states to say, hey, we have to sign this thing, took 2 months to arrive. Right? They were sent in December, and they were absentee already at this point, but these letters were sent in December, and they didn't arrive until February. But even then, a fair number of those states just didn't acknowledge the receipt of those letters, and I'm not sure what their deal was, but I do know that in desperation, the Congress, led by Thomas Jefferson, who didn't get a role in this series, but he had a lot of things that he did, like that thing, again, the Declaration of Independence, which he wrote. He had a plan to ratify the treaty with only 7 states instead of the 9 required by the Articles of Confederation. And he really did not want to do this because he did not want to give the British any excuse to back out and say that this wasn't a valid legal treaty. But they were under a time crunch because they were afraid that France would soon be distracted by a European war. There were rumors that Russia and Turkey were about to go at it, and France might want to get involved in that rather than this, across the seas war. And they were also afraid that Britain would rather revoke the treaty than give them a deadline extension so that they could get those absentee states to actually show up. So there was this whole desperation plan for, last minute, if nothing else works, we'll do this. And then the delegates from Connecticut finally straggle in very, very late. And they just need one more person from South Carolina. And there's one guy named Richard Beresford who deserves all the credit in the world because he was super duper sick and just in his sickbed. And he dragged himself out of his sickbed to Annapolis, Maryland, through a blizzard, to sign the Treaty of Paris.
I was always surprised that they couldn't get anybody who was just living in Annapolis who was from those states and just declare them a delegate.
I think that probably would have opened them to the same kind of thing where Britain would say that's not really legal under your own laws, but
Let's talk about Shays Rebellion, because we didn't get a chance to talk about it in the series. Why don't we go into it, since it's usually considered such a big part of what moves us away from the Articles into the Constitution.
Right. So I'm glad a lot of people noticed and brought it up. There was actually, in my very first draft, I had something about Shays Rebellion, and it summarized the rebellion and what it was, and I cut it because I didn't feel like it was giving proper time to discuss what is a really complicated rebellion. It involves state governments raising an army against their own people and fighting battles against their own people. And it's it's not really glorious, obviously. What happened was basically that merchants in the Northeast, especially in Massachusetts, were demanding payment in gold or silver from these rural farmers of Massachusetts who had always basically done barter, right? There was not a whole lot of specie out there. But the European creditors had caught on to the fact that this American money issued by the Articles was not stable or solid, and so they were insisting that all of their American partners now pay them in gold or silver. So they needed to get the gold and silver from somewhere, and they tried to get it out of rural farmers. And these rural farmers didn't have it. And what's more, we still had a bunch of veterans, like Daniel Shays, who led this rebellion, who had fought in the war. And he was one of the unlucky people who, when the army was dismissed, he wasn't paid, and he went home and he got thrown in debtor's prison. And so he and a number of other people helped orchestrate this rebellion, and they shut down the courthouses in Massachusetts. And the Articles, the Congress, scrambled to raise an army to respond to this and weren't really effective. So Massachusetts wound up raising its own army and going to war with their own people. And by the way, they magically had the money to pay for that militia. But yeah, it's a really ugly period in history, and it's also tied up with something as important as Vermont statehood, the very first state to join the Union that wasn't part of the original 13. I mentioned earlier, New York claimed control over Vermont. Vermont disagreed, and there was this whole thing. And because of that, New York had been blocking Vermont's application to become a state. But when Shays Rebellion happened and the Massachusetts militia defeated the forces of the rebellion, a lot of those people, and especially their leaders, fled to Vermont for sanctuary. And it was at this point that New York, and especially Alexander Hamilton, who comes up again, Alexander Hamilton said, you know what, if they're not a state, then they can do whatever they want. And that means that we will always have someone right next to us that is not bound by the same rules that we are. Mm-hmm. And it would just be beneficial for us to get them to be a state. So New York actually removed its objections as a result of this. And Vermont's statehood was approved somewhat after it. And all of this was going on during that Annapolis Convention, where Hamilton called for the Articles of Convention to be reformed entirely, or he basically called for the Constitutional Convention. So it was going on in a very complicated time, and it played a huge role in influencing a lot of people who were sort of on the fence about whether or not we should actually reform this Articles of Confederation into saying, yeah, these really aren't working, because they were scared of their own people rising against them. And so it's a really complicated thing. And so the short paragraph that I had that I summarized it in, I felt like didn't do it justice. And what I would really like to do is come back to Shays Rebellion in the form of a one-off.
Yeah, I think that it's one of those things that I do this all the time too, where there are topics that should get more depth and don't necessarily need to be part of this particular thing. I would like to see Shays Rebellion get a one-off at some point. I'm hoping that we go back and do the same thing with the Constitution and the immediate post-Constitution period as well.
Yeah.
Because I think that juxtaposing those two series would be really neat.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to do it, but I didn't want to give it short shrift, and it's similar to, why we didn't wind up discussing a lot of the Native American issues or the slavery issues in this series, because I think those are really important, and I think it's important that if you discuss them well, and you don't just throw in a single line about, oh, by the way, this sucked.
It's really tough, right? I mean, I actually am unsure in my own mind sometimes, especially with issues like those where you're dealing with peoples and effects that are certainly still present and still felt today. Whether it's better to at least acknowledge the situation, or if it's better to wait until we can deal with it in the manner that is appropriate and has the gravitas that it requires.
And I completely agree. And there is a worrisome element of erasure in not saying something about it. And I think it's something that I'm trying to work into my writing a little better.
Well, and it's why
a lot better, but yeah.
I mean, it's part of why I think we brought it up here, was to make sure that at least we could talk about it. I mean, that's what Lies is for, is to talk about all the things that we didn't feel like we could do justice to in the piece itself. And sometimes it's things like that that are not just interesting anecdotes, but the sort of heavy repercussions that deserve at least to be acknowledged and hopefully later to be explored.
Yeah.
All right, so let's move on to something slightly lighter. Walpole. I know what one I would do. I would choose salutary neglect, because I think I actually already mentioned it in the Bolivar episodes, but Walpole was actually the guy who sort of established the colonial policy of just let's be hands off, collect what we can, and let them run their own affairs. And there's a lot of argument amongst a lot of historians that ending salutary neglect, ending Walpole's policy, and trying to have more direct control over the colonies is what provoked the revolutionary actions.
Yeah, so I kind of thought that might come to mind, and it's a good one. It's a very good Walpole, but I figured I should work a little harder for my Walpole.
Excellent.
Yes, and there were Walpole fingerprints all over this. There was salutary neglect. His son Horace was back home in London, I guess, and writing all about the American Revolutionary War all the time. But we're going to talk about his nephew, Thomas Walpole.
I actually don't know anything about Thomas.
Thomas Walpole formed the Walpole Company, which was intended to settle a portion of the Ohio River Valley. And the company went through a lot of permutations and a lot of changes, and it actually never wound up getting official approval from the crown, so it never became an official colony. But several evolutions down the line, Walpole Company became Vandalia Company. I don't know where it came from. But they wanted to create a new colony called Vandalia, and they wanted the crown's approval to make it a colony. And Vandalia is modern-day West Virginia, so it didn't quite work out for them. But it had a very interesting history, because there had been a sort of idea that it was formed to be a state, so the people of Vandalia tried to be a state, nonstop, and there was a big thing where at one point the guy who was in charge of Vandalia, I think they tried to name themselves after Franklin, and Franklin said, "Please don't." And they tried to apply to the Confederation Congress for approval, and Congress was not about that. They were busy fighting a war right then. So they were like, well, maybe we should apply to the Spanish, maybe we should apply to the French. It was a whole thing. Very Walpolean.
That is a story also, even though less historical value, I would love to hear at some point. But since we've gone on, let us move on to talking about the fact that there's some awesome music by the Kiners up.
Yes. It's a tribute to in Article 11, the invitation for Canada to join. You Canadians, if you listen closely, may recognize a little bit of your national anthem in there.
That's awesome. This is why I love working with those guys.
They're right. And we have fantastic art by Lil Chan, the artist for this series.
And I'm blanking. What is the next series?
The next series is the Bronze Age Collapse.
Oh, right. I did that a long time ago.
Well, it was in the Bronze Age.
Yep. Bronze Age Collapse is going to be a blast.
It really is.
It's this fascinating period that we don't talk about enough, where you've got highly complex, highly connected societies in the in about 1700 BC. And then all of a sudden, society everywhere just goes dark, right? And there's all sorts of mysteries surrounding it. There are sea people coming in and invading. There's fires and earthquakes and plagues. And so, join us next time for the Bronze Age Collapse. And I guess we'll see you all then.
Bye-bye.